Come back to both of you in a bit. I'm delighted to be joined by the Chancellor, Philip Hammond. Very good to see you, Chancellor.
Good to see you.
I mean, I really want to put the same question that I put to Nick right at the beginning, which is, in your view, who is responsible for Kim Darroch resigning? Is it the US President or is it Boris Johnson who failed to back him?
Well, I'm going to give the same answer as Nick. I haven't talked to Kim Darroch, and I am a former Foreign Secretary, and I would just like to put on the record that he is a first-class public servant. I've known him in many roles.
Was there anything improper that he said in those emails?
No, not at all. Emails written by diplomats all over the world back to their home governments have to reflect not just the narrative of what's going on in the country where they're posted, but the gossip, the political tittle-tattle that's going on around town. It's the way in which governments keep themselves informed. And, you know, frankly, the Americans know this. The Americans will know that their diptels, going back to Washington over the last few years, I'm sure will have contained some quite lurid comments on some of the things that we've been doing here. That's how diplomacy works. But of course, it is absolutely essential that these things are kept confidential. But it's very important that governments are informed about what's going on in the capitals of their allies and partners.
Can I just double-check? I mean, your successor as Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, signally failed to back Kim Darroch last night. Were you surprised and disappointed?
I'm signally backing him.
You are?
Here this evening, yeah.
And you're signally not backing Boris Johnson?
Kim Darroch has been a first-class public servant, and will, I hope, go on to continue to be a first-class public servant. He's done a good job as ambassador in Washington. But of course, all of us, many of us, will be in a position where if things we have written in confidence were to be published, that would put us in a very difficult position.
So I mean, last direct question on this particular issue. Was Boris Johnson wrong last night in not standing up for Kim Darroch?
Well, I think as a former Foreign Secretary, I would have felt the obligation to stand up for a first-class civil servant who's done nothing wrong. Kim Darroch has done nothing wrong in this affair. I
mean, the other thing which I pointed out that actually slightly sort of shocked me overnight yesterday was that the US President said some extraordinarily personally rude things about the Prime Minister. And actually, pretty much until Jeremy Hunt stood up last night, almost no senior Tories actually stood up and said a US President must not make personal attacks on a head of government in this country in that way. It was extraordinary, wasn't it?
But we know that Donald Trump does say things on Twitter, and after 2.5 years, perhaps people aim off a bit for it. Perhaps they're not quite as sensitive to some of those off-the-cuff remarks. What I would just gently remind the President is that Sir Kim Darroch was Her Majesty's ambassador in Washington, and I do know that President Trump has the highest regard for Her Majesty.
Well, he said that in his tweet, didn't he? Which was rather striking. Now, I don't know if you heard him, but you'll be aware that Sir John Major this morning said that if the new Prime Minister, who, as I say, many people expect to be Boris Johnson, tries to suspend Parliament in order to push through a no-deal Brexit, he will try and get that stopped through the courts. Would you support the former Prime Minister, John Major, if he does that?
Yes, and before he gets there to the courts, I and others would try and stop it happening through Parliament. It's one thing to have a debate about the type of Brexit. It's one thing to discuss the wisdom of a no-deal Brexit, but it's quite another to say that we will stop Parliament from working in case Parliament gets in our way. I mean, that really takes us to the brink of a genuine constitutional crisis. We cannot allow that to happen.
And do you think the mechanisms are there for MPs to block a no-deal Brexit?
Yes.
The levers are there?
Yes, I think so, so long as Parliament is not prorogued.
But you're also saying that you think proroguing, or are you saying you're not 100% confident that you could stop a new Prime Minister from proroguing Parliament?
So not
I mean, you're going to try,
not
but...
Not 100% confident, but I think there's a group of members of Parliament who feel very, very strongly about this, and you know, they will be mostly people who are very anti-no deal, but there will be parliamentarians of all views who feel that the use of prorogation as a way of avoiding parliamentary scrutiny is just completely unacceptable. So there will be attempts, I'm sure, in Parliament to prevent the prorogation of Parliament. And if they are unsuccessful, I'm sure, and anyone were foolish enough to try to prorogue Parliament, then I'm sure there will be action in the courts. And
you would support it?
And Sir John Major, well, we'd have to challenge it. We'd have to challenge it. The idea that elected members of Parliament will be locked out of their place of work because they might do their job is truly shocking.
I think that's unambiguous. Now, you may be aware that Boris Johnson said on ITV's debate last night that the costs of a no-deal Brexit would be, in his words, vanishingly small if we prepared adequately. What do you think of that analysis?
Well, it's wrong.
It's just straightforwardly wrong.
It's just straightforwardly wrong. The problem, of course, we should be as prepared as we possibly can if we believe there's a risk of a no-deal Brexit. But the problem is most of the levers that will determine how that works are in the hands of others.
Yeah.
In the hands of the EU, in the hands of the member states, in the hands of private sector players within the UK economy. And they will make their own decisions, and they'll make their own decisions in their own interests and for their own reasons, not for the convenience of the British government. So there are some things that the government can do and should do, and we are doing them. For example, HMRC is making progress all the time at having its systems better positioned to cope with the consequences of a no-deal exit. But HMRC has no sway at all over what the French authorities are doing. As it happens, I think the French authorities are likely to have technical solutions that are quite good. But how they deploy them will be entirely a choice for them, and they will use the deployment of those systems as a political tool in what will be quite a row if we end up leaving in a no-deal scenario. Think the border between Spain and Gibraltar.
Yep.
On a good day, it can be working very smoothly. But if our Spanish friends decide that for any reason they want to dial up the temperature, they just turn a dial and suddenly there are 2-3 hour queues.
I mean, one other sort of aspect of all of this is obviously the Northern Ireland border with the Republic of Ireland. James Forsyth in The Spectator is talking about how Cox, the Attorney General, he says came quite close, apparently, to negotiating an arrangement with the EU whereby, and I have to say I found this rather difficult to believe, and that's why I want to put it to you, whereby Michel Barnier, the EU's negotiator, would have accepted an arrangement in which the so-called backstop would just disappear if trade negotiations broke down between the UK and the EU. Now, as far as I was aware, that's completely the opposite of what the backstop is there for. I mean, so do you recognise this at all?
I wasn't in the room, but that's certainly not my understanding of that negotiation. My understanding of the EU's position is that the backstop is an insurance policy. It's not something that they would relish being brought into play, but they regard it as essential to have it there as an insurance policy to make sure that the UK doesn't simply walk away from its obligations to maintain an open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
Now, just briefly on this before we move on, when I interviewed Jeremy Hunt recently, he pointed me towards Bank of England analysis, which showed that in a no-deal Brexit case, the shock to the economy would be similar, maybe a little bit less severe, but similar to what happened during the banking crisis in the autumn of 2008. Do you share that view that the shock could be of that magnitude?
It could be. I think there are two things. There's a short-term shock from the disruption that a no-deal Brexit would bring, and then there's a longer-term impact on our economy. And there's no doubt that our economy will suffer both short-term disruption and in the long term will be smaller than it otherwise would have been. That means that at any given point in the future, the British people will be less well off than they could have been.
Now, you are opposed to a no deal. Your colleague Dominic Grieve put down some amendments yesterday to try and prevent a no deal. Why didn't you support those amendments?
Because I'm a member of the government. The government opposed those amendments.
And did you try and persuade the Prime Minister not to oppose those amendments?
I'm not going to comment on internal discussions that we have within the government.
So there have been reports that you're engaged in a delicate negotiation with the Prime Minister about opening your chequebook for her favourite projects if she helps you to block a no-deal Brexit.
Well, I'm not going to comment on the discussions I have with the Prime Minister. I've read those reports too.
Do you want to deny them?
Ask my wife. I'm notoriously difficult to persuade to open a chequebook in any circumstances.
So can the Prime Minister therefore park to one side this idea of a public spending legacy?
So we're going to have a spending review later on this year, and it's absolutely right that public spending bids are considered in the round. There won't be enough money to deal with all the bids for social care, policing, defence, education, higher education, schools, all the rest of it. That we will have to prioritise, and the only fair way to do that is in the round through an organised and disciplined process. And in the meantime, if colleagues have specific technical problems that need addressing, the Treasury is always there and always ready to help.
Now, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, so if I could do what's very fashionable at the moment, which is a quick fire. So here we go. What's worse, no-deal Brexit or general election?
Well, a no-deal Brexit is a very bad outcome for this country. And I think before we got to anything like that, we would have to consult the British people in one form or another, and a general election is a form of doing that.
Are you going to fight the next election?
My intention is to do so. I don't know when it's going to be yet, but that's my intention.
And do you fancy the IMF job?
No.
You don't? What about George Osborne? Has he got a chance?
Look, I don't fancy the IMF job, but I also wouldn't fancy my chances of being the UK's nominee for it under the next administration.
And finally, if it is Boris Johnson, are you going to jump before you're pushed?
Look, my expectation is that I will not be serving in the next administration. But I want to say this, because I read some stuff in the papers earlier this week about how I would be a nightmare on the backbenches. I will continue to argue vigorously against a no-deal Brexit, and I will certainly do everything I can to prevent a no-deal Brexit without parliamentary approval. But the new Prime Minister, both candidates have said they want to try and negotiate a deal. And we should give the new Prime Minister a chance to show what he can do. And if he is pursuing a deal, then I will support him all the way. And if I can do anything to help, I will be happy to do it. We need to resolve this by getting a deal. That means reaching out to the Europeans. It means reaching out to the Labour Party in Parliament. It means reaching out to the Irish government. It means the new Prime Minister looking at the cards that he's been dealt, which won't be very different from the ones that Theresa May held, and seeing if he can shuffle the pack differently to get to the right answer. And if he does that, I and many of my colleagues will be right behind him. But if he decides to go for no deal as a policy, no deal on October 31st as a policy, then we will do everything in our power to prevent him from doing that.
Lovely to see you as always. You may not be in the Cabinet for much longer, but we'd love you back anytime you're free. Always a joy to talk to you.